Hi, I'm going to talk about on-call. Is anybody on call in here today? More hands than I was expecting. You weren't on call with the lost YubiKey, were you? Okay, fantastic. Because you were about to not be on call anymore. I'm talking about on-call today because it's near and dear to my heart, but it's sort of selfish because I also think we've sort of given up on on-call. I feel that on-call is a whole lot of sort of models that we copy, a lot of folk models, a lot of cargo culting, a lot of things that we bring over from past experiences, and I don't see it changing very often. And I want to talk to you today about how we can change that. If you read the preview for my talk, you know that I'm going to talk about how we can implement an on-call program, sort of a capital P program within the organization. We're going to do that, we're going to talk about it, but this stuff is also applicable even at the small scale. I also did not coordinate with Alex at the beginning, but you're going to see a few things in my talk that are similar to his. His covered some of them better. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. But yeah, I feel like we've given up on on-call, and I want to make that better. Now, why should you listen to me about any of this? First off, as I already said, my name is Cory. I have been on call for almost 30 years, which is pretty rad. My first on-call experience was at a dial-up ISP in rural Tennessee, doing customer support and stuff. It was pretty great. And then I have also been on call at places like Twitter in the before times. And then at places like Stripe, all this other sort of stuff. And I've also been a builder, a buyer, and a seller of all these tools. What I mean by this is like I built a lot of the tools that teams use internally to manage on-call processes, and that's all the stuff in the space. That's observability stuff, monitoring, alerting, all these things. I was also a buyer. I would go out and buy these from vendors. I wasn't always building them. Sometimes I was buying them. And I sold in two different ways. I think many of you are probably familiar with the idea of selling internally. You can set up a tool, but that doesn't mean that anyone's going to use it inside because socio-technical systems are hard. So we have to find ways to sell that internally. I'm a big fan of servant teams that sort of go out and become centers of excellence in themselves, but then go out and help everyone sort of get better. But I have also done sales enablement in like the office of the CTO at places. Please forgive me. But I owned on-call alerting stacks, observability tooling, all that sort of stuff. And for the last year and a half, what sort of motivated me to write this talk was that, full disclosure, I started a company that's going to do some on-call stuff. It's mentioned here, but that's the last place we'll probably mention it. And I talked to hundreds of people about on-call. Part of building a startup and building a product is doing product discovery. So I needed to talk to ICs, managers, leadership about on-call stuff. It made me a little sad to talk about on-call, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to write this talk. So first, I want to, as was mentioned earlier about empathy, I want to be empathetic to the fact that for a lot of people, on-call is super anxiety-inducing. I spent a large part of my career not really being fazed by being on call. Like I could get paged, I could deal with problems in the middle of the night. It's probably roughly proportional to being young, at least in my experience. And then I got older and it got much harder. But even today, I'm not sure what changed in my career, but at some point I got really sort of frustrated by that page. I could feel it in my gut. Even now, I can still feel getting paged. I'm sure many of you have had this experience. And you shouldn't feel bad about it. I've watched a lot of talks on like being humane and setting up healthy on-call and the psychological effects of on-call. I encourage you to check all of those out. They're very important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today. But I do want to acknowledge that this stuff is hard, it's organic, and it sneaks up on you. When you start a company with just a few people on call, it's fine to just sort of do whatever. Like we could just page everybody at the same time. That'll be fine. Everybody's on call all the time. We've all experienced this. And on call, even at large companies, tends to be very sort of fractal. You like, okay, well, we got big enough that now we can do cool stuff like primaries and secondaries and shadows or tertiaries and escalations and all these sorts of crazy things. How we implement them, I think, is often just sort of however the VP of engineering used to do it or what have you. But there's often little to no oversight here. And I want to make sure I point out that this is a feature because it turns out product engineering teams have very different workloads and interrupt situations than infrastructure teams, for example. In my experience as an infrastructure engineer and an SRE, I get woken up by computers a lot. But when you work on a product team, you get woken up by people a lot. You get woken up by angry customers, angry sales, and angry support teams. So it's important that teams have their own sort of agency and how they solve these problems. That is a feature that I learned over the last year. No one wants the computer to yell at them and tell them how they have to do on call. It's better to set up guidance. And also this stuff is just kind of completely unpredictable. So on-call is a thing we do. It's sort of a burden. It's in almost everybody's job description. Many of you are on call today. But I want to think about it a little more formally. On-call is a system for dealing with weird. Weird things happen during the course of operations. If any of us are successful enough to work at a place where we have customers, weird things are going to happen. And the point of on-call is to deal with this weird. If we knew what was going to happen, if it was a known unknown or what have you, then there would be some sort of automation or whatever. You've probably got lots of tools in your tool belts and in your quivers that you deploy for known situations. But on-call is about dealing with weird. And specifically, going back to some of the stuff that was mentioned earlier about Woods' work in Graceful I forget that expression now, but the one that was mentioned earlier by Alex, on-call is about the capacity to deal with weird. It is a function that we build inside our organizations to deal with weird things happening. It can be thought of in systems thinking just like any other tool in our space. But we don't tend to think about it this way. We put people on call. If they get woken up too much and they complain about it, then we all know about it. How many of you know a team in your experience at places that you've worked that has had like a really crappy on-call? You might have been on that team. I lost this monitor. Oh, came back, never mind. Great. Problems, weird. Okay, so you've had bad experiences on call. How many of you known about other teams that had bad experiences on call and you didn't want to be on those teams? How many of you have ever helped a friend get off of a team that had a bad on-call to come over to your team? Right? This stuff turns out to actually matter. If we want to fix this, we need some sort of a plan. We can't just sort of say, well, we're all, something I liked about Alex's talk is that, well, we're just in over our heads. You have to put together a plan. You can't just wish things better. The wish reservoir is empty. We're going to have to actually come up with a plan for this. Hence the title of this talk, which is Rethinking How We Approach On-Call. I don't want to cargo cult and copy and do things the way that we did it at our last job anymore just because we did. No more of this. So if we're going to rethink on-call, we need an approach here. We need a plan. And I'm going to break all this down for you into a couple of different categories. I've already mentioned capacity and the idea of thinking about systems in terms of capacity. But I also want to talk about the envelope, which I think is a funny word because I say envelope when I mean flight envelope. I say envelope when I'm going to send a letter. I'm not sure why. I don't know if that's common. Proactive instead of reactive approaches to on-call. On-ramps, because how do we get people on call? It's not just, well, Cory's been here 2 weeks, time to put him in the rotation. And then finally, we will talk about approaching this as a program. Because ultimately, I'd love for organizations to dedicate resources and time to this. We'll talk about that later. But even in your own personal work, you can apply some of these ideas to what you do every day. So I've already talked a little bit about capacity, but I want to come back to it because I think it's really, really important. And so I have another sort of audience interaction moment here, which is important to keeping everyone engaged in a talk. How many of you have ever said to, or had this said to you, hey, when you're on call this week, don't worry about your normal work. Don't worry about that. Just focus on making on-call better. How many have said that or had that said to them? Okay. How many of you got promoted for it? That's my next question. I think we're lying. We didn't sign up at most of these places to do this kind of work. When we interviewed or when we saw the job description on the website, it was like, come to this company and do this thing that's really important to the mission. Everyone's signed up to do that. Or maybe if you work at a bigger organization, it was to work on a specific technology or work with a specific person or a specific group, whatever it was. There was some alignment there. And not only did you not sign up to do most of this sort of like sweep it into this sort of I call it the like operational junk drawer, is what I like to think of on-call as. That's not what you signed up to do. And importantly, if we're thinking about capacity here, the capacity that I'm trying to measure is mostly people-shaped stuff. A lot of managers really get frustrated at dealing with on-call because it's mostly dealing with messy social people situations. We have to talk to people about their experiences and how they feel and what they're doing outside of work and why they were slow to answer the page or what have you. And so if we're going to talk about people, we have to come up with ways to measure people. So there's no good way around this. We're just going to have to ask people about their experiences on call. And it would be really rad if we kept up with what people said. This is a very subjective measurement. And I think it's very important to think about it in terms of trends, not in terms of like literal measures. I don't think too many people want Clippy to pop up at the end of the on-call rotation and say, it sounds like you had a bad time. Is there something I can do to help you? But you probably want your manager to ask. Has anybody worked in a place that like when you have your one-on-one with a manager, they ask you if you're like sort of green, yellow, red that week, how you're feeling in terms of utilization? It's a common practice, right? Why don't we do that at the end of on-call? Because they're not all equal. It's very unpredictable. The workloads are weird. Your personal experiences are weird, et cetera. How confident are you coming into on-call? I've been on call for 30 years. I've been on call some places for a long time, some places for a short time. I can tell you I am never particularly confident about it. I'm always scared, more so, I guess, these days than I used to be. How rested are you? Are you getting enough vacation? All this kind of stuff. These are really important to how successful you're going to be at on-call, because if you're not doing all of these things, you're going to have issues. You're going to have issues because this stuff has very real impact. I mentioned earlier there were lots of talks about healthy on-call situations, all that kind of stuff. I don't need to show you citations for all the papers that will show you if you wake someone up in the middle of the night, they're going to have a bad day. It's a trope, right? You got woken up in the middle of the night for some reason, you wake up the next morning, you're telling your partner or your cat or whatever's in your house, you're like, oh, woken up again, I'm going to have one of those days. Cognitively, this stuff has significant actual measurable impact on you. If you're waking up your engineers 3 daes out of the week, they're not going to do a very effective job of burning down the aforementioned backlog, right? They're just not going to be all there. Debugging's going to take longer. Everything's a little ickier. Ultimately, it just makes for crappy performance. So if we're going to measure this, which is really the goal of a lot of what I'm talking about today, how can we measure it? It's subjective, it's weird, it's icky, it's humans, there's a dance out of that. I'm going to cite, my clicker's not clear, there it goes. The resilience assessment grid is the thing I'd like to talk about next. Eric Hollnagel was mentioned in the last talk in his work with Dave Woods. I'm mentioning by himself right here. There is a URL here that you probably can't read either due to contrast or the frequent %20s in it, but as you search for Hollnagel and resilience assessment, you will find it. But the idea here, if on-call is a system for dealing with weird, it's a system for making systems or organizations resilient. If something breaks in the middle of the night, we want to do a good job of assembling it back together as quickly as possible. We need that resilience. We want to bend. We don't want to break. So my favorite part of this paper is Hollnagel defines 4 attributes that define resilience. You know why he picked 4? Because he said 3 was too few, 5 was too many. That's my favorite part of the talk, or my favorite part of the paper, is that he's just like, I don't know, it just feels like the right number. And when asked if these were the 4 best things, he said, well, I don't know, I think these are the 4 ones that everyone says are common. There were others, but these are the ones he picked. They're his favorite. The 4 things that make a resilient system are the ability to respond, monitor, learn, and anticipate. You probably know what respond and monitor mean. Yes, you should respond, but I also want you to keep in mind that being actionable is an important part of responding. You don't just want to take your phone out and click acknowledge and slip it back in your pocket. You want to actually know what to do when the system pages you in the middle of the night. Monitor, I think we can all move through. We know about alerting, we know about dashboards and stuff. The last 2 are my favorite and the ones I want to spend time on today. If we want to think about how people's experience is when they're on call, we could just ask them these 4 questions and see what that experience looks like. Do we have a system that is trending in a direction where we are responding, monitoring, learning, and anticipating better? I shopped this around quite a bit when I was doing product discovery, and everybody kind of liked it. Learning, they were like, yeah, I want them to learn. But as we were talking about earlier in Alex's talk, we need to be learning all the time. The systems are changing, people are leaving. If we're not learning more about how the system functions and works, we don't have a healthy system. We need to understand it. The last one, anticipation, I had a lot of problems with. A lot of VPs especially would be like, what do you mean anticipate? How am I supposed to anticipate what happens when I'm on call? It's weird. It's weird stuff. How am I going to anticipate that? I ended up having to change this word to being prepared. And then I got a better response. You're like, oh, preparation, okay. So we talked about it, we worked through it, et cetera. So maybe if you're trying to do this, you may want to think about it in terms of preparation as well. But the summary here is I want you to think about asking these questions of yourself, of your team, or as an entire program, measuring this with the resilience assessment grid. Because the idea is that people who do a good job of this are more resilient. We saw some of that in Alex's talk, that the idea of learning and growing as a team requires some of this. So that is the capacity part of the talk. Next, I want to talk about the envelope. The envelope in my, this is a thing I've termed by myself, being on call typically requires some sort of a person, they get paged, within so many minutes it will escalate and it will go to somebody else. Maybe there are other people involved, either width-wise or depth-wise. The escalations have times. It eventually goes to a VP of engineering. They're super pissed off because they didn't want to get paged, all that sort of stuff. The envelope is the sort of technical definition of how that works. Very few organizations that I've encountered sort of think of this as an overall measurable thing, but it's kind of mathy. I'm not a math person, so I won't say anything else about math. Well, maybe I will, but not much at least. Here, and this is going back to something that Alex was talking about, I want to talk about the use method. Is anybody familiar with the use method? Have we heard of this before in systems performance? Oh, that's wonderful. You're a wonderful crowd. So another URL you can't read at the bottom, but Brendan Gregg developed a thing he calls the use method. You've probably heard of the RED method, right? RED is sort of related, requests, errors, and durations. The use method is utilization, saturation, and errors. This rhymes quite a bit with the last talk. Utilization, saturation, errors, this is all Q theory stuff, Little's Law, all that kind of stuff. Utilization is the time spent doing work. Saturation is when you can't do work anymore, and there's probably a queue. And errors are, I don't know, whatever undesirable output, not doing the work, throwing exceptions, whatever that is. If we think about our on-call arrangement, whatever that is for you, we need to think about this in terms of how can we measure it, because if it gets saturated or if it has issues, we have issues. We have lost the capacity to deal with weird. I wish the next slide had the answers for exactly how you should use the use method to do this, but instead it has some suggestions. Because dear friends, you need to cook up your own way of doing this in the organization, but I have some ideas. If we talk about utilization, how much time are you actually spending doing work related to on-call? If you're doing 100%, that's probably too much. We already learned that you're falling behind if you're above 75%. I'd also argue, though, that if you're doing 0%, if you come out of an on-call week and you never got page, that feels like a win, but it also meant we didn't get to exercise or grow any of the things that we described in the resilience assessment grid earlier. We didn't get to respond, monitor, learn, or anticipate. And I'd argue that if you're on call all the time or on call none of the time, you're not really on call. And it's specifically important, I mean, if you're on call all the time, if you're one of those poor souls who's always on call for something, it's just untenable. You just can't do it. So measuring this and looking at how it's utilized when it gets saturated. Saturation is a tricky one in a lot of systems to measure. It's easy in I/O because we have like I/O queuing, backlogs, that sort of thing. But for people, it's a little tougher. I'd argue that things like how much time you spend servicing requests off hours can be considered saturation, because you don't want to be doing that. You want to be living your life or watching Shogun or whatever's hip right now. Errors at the end could be a lot of things as well. Errors, when people get escalated past, when you don't know how to deal with a problem. Have you ever been paged for something and realized you didn't have the credentials to fix it? Like, that's an error. That's a bad thing. That shouldn't happen. And if we can record these, we can be much more effective at how we approach on-call. Now, this is, it has speaker's notes up here, and underneath it, it just says no notes. That's fun. No notes on this slide. This slide is perfect. So we can also look at this a little bit mathy. I don't love this slide. It's kind of my least favorite part of it. But like, we can look at the overall maximum latency. When we say we're going to page somebody, how long is it going to be before the VP of engineering gets paged, right? We also should really look, though, at the feasibility of these. Have you ever been on call for a rotation that says you must answer the phone within 5 minutes? Have you ever showered? Right? Like, I was in a hotel room this morning with, let's just say, inadequate hot water, and I still took more than 5 minutes. I actually timed myself just for this talk. I started the timer, I got in the shower, took a shower, and I got out, and I was like, I know that took less than 5 minutes because it was cold. No, it still took more than 5 minutes. You can't reasonably expect to answer it in 5 minutes. That's an unrealistic expectation. If you're a VP of engineering or a manager and you're doing this to people, I don't know what to tell you. You're just going to have to change it. But ultimately, we also need to think about the depth of the bench for this. If you're like, whew, we got through Christmas, we finally got someone who can be on call for that week where it's really thorny. If you've only got one person, that's not resilience, because you're probably going to have a problem. You may need to escalate. Something's going to come up. That person doesn't have every bit of knowledge in their head, so the depth of the bench is really important. Also, the repercussion of violations. Like, if you've been on call for that 5-minute rotation, I guarantee you had some slip. Do you get fired for that? Like, what are the consequences? I feel like we need to be honest about talking about these things. Okay, so that was sort of my least favorite part of the talk. It's important, and I think we should be measuring these things in a very technical way. It's much better than counting incidents, friends. I probably don't need to tell that to this room. I'm sure we all feel that way. Also, everything that pages you is not an incident. Okay? The literature calls these disturbances sometimes. Not everything that pages you need to get turned into an incident. An incident is a social construct that you apply a rubric to decide that you want to employ all of the resources of the organization and bring it to bear. Guess who pays attention to incidents? Leadership. Do you want them because some alert went off in the middle of the night? I don't like that language. I wish vendors would stop associating all incidents with on-call. But anyway, that's just my bone to pick. So if we don't want to just dwell in the world of math for a little while, how can I get out of this world? Well, let's talk about being proactive. On-call, by its nature, and honestly the thing I'm the most upset about in our just universal approach to on-call, is that it is too reactive. By definition, almost, on-call means you are on-call to receive an alert because something bad happened. Some alert fired, some customer complained. It is a reaction. Many, many, many tools talk about helping you see problems before your customers do. Have any of you ever received a 500 or something similar to that when you're using a web face on a product? Do you think you knew first? Do you think their alert was that sensitive? Are you on call for that? Because I feel bad. You shouldn't be. You're almost never going to know before your customer does. It's shorthand, and I know what it means, but I feel like it's disingenuous. Instead, how can we think about our on-call teams being set up to be proactive? To me, this is the big value proposition in turning on-call from something that's frustrating and a burden that we all suffer with as an industry to being something that we can genuinely look at as an asset and a forward-thinking approach to doing on-call within organizations. You can tell this is my favorite part of the talk. So, how do we get proactive? How are we positioned in the coming week for on-call? If all of us were on call for something today, we would probably sit around and talk about it if we had our just time. We'd sit around and say, okay, well, what's going on this week? I don't know what to be on call for this week with this entire room. Let's say it's the weather. Is there anything forecast for this week? Wow, forecast, that's a novel idea. What's going on this week? What's shipping? What's going out into the world? What are our customers doing? Do you have any big customers coming on board? Why are we not having that conversation with everybody who's on call? Why is everyone who's on call in the organization not privy to that discussion? I guarantee you your product managers would love to talk to you. So would your support staff, who often knows a whole hell of a lot more about what's going on with your customer than you do. On-call optimally would own a whole lot of things in my world. Do you ever check with the on-call before you do something weird in production? I fully support doing weird things in production, but do you check with the on-call first? I don't want to make them gatekeepers. I don't mean for them to be arbiters of everything that happens, but you should probably check with them because they're probably privy to more about what's going on in the state of the system. Again, sort of the green, yellow, red idea. If they think it's kind of yellow right now, maybe you should hold off on your weird little experiment. But if you can justify it, then maybe you should still do it. Holidays, all this sort of stuff, important periods, like if you work in finance, not finance, retail in any way, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, that's a big deal for you. Are you thinking ahead? Do you have the right people on call for this? You might think that I mean the grizzled old veteran on the team who's seen every Black Friday, Cyber Monday. I do mean them, but I also mean the new people who haven't seen them yet. Are they working together? Could we bring together 2 or 3 people who have mixed experiences and put all of them on call simultaneously? Why are we only putting 1 person on call? Why not 2 or 3 people simultaneously? And I also already mentioned the product roadmap. I also know there was one person I talked to about a year ago who worked at a place where they had specifically, tiger teams as a concept comes up sometimes, like teams that are specifically cross-disciplinary and attack thorny problems within an organization. Why don't we do that with on-call? There was a company that I talked to once who said they had the site is slow on-call rotation. We're all experiencing this. It's often the joke of the thing that no one knows how to fix. The site is slow, it's too vague, but it is usually the problem. And it was a very cross-discipline part of the organization to say well, let's get some people who have been here a long time, who know how to do these vague things. They're usually the ones who know where all the skeletons are. They're the ones who you want to retain. Some organizations do primary, first level on-call and secondary on-call. You maybe go to the secondary when things get a little too thorny for the primary. That's a good way to sort of mitigate the problems of having people on call. No one really likes to be on call, but we know it's part of the job. But if you're tenured and you've been around a while, maybe that's a way that you can retain your employees more easily. I have so many ideas about this, but I only have 6 minutes left in my talk. On-call handoffs are incredibly cool. There's a great paper by Chad Todd called On-Call Communications in Incidents or something to that effect. It's really, really great. It inspired a lot of what sort of brought me back into wanting to work on on-call related things. How many of you do on-call handoffs with your team? How many of you write the document on Monday morning? Yeah. You forgot a lot of stuff probably by Monday morning. How many of you read the on-call handoff documents? 5 hands in the whole room. That was cool. Yeah, so I already mentioned experiments, tests, and deployments. Formalizing shadows. How many of you shadow on-calls? Do you have a formal process where if you've been on call for a long time, you shadow a new person when they come on call? I think I saw 1 hand over here. Oh, a shaky hand. Ooh, man, it's so cool. Why are you not helping people whenever they come into your team? You want more friends to be on call with you, right? You don't want to own this by yourself. Don't just switch companies. Also, have you ever been at a place where you had more than 1 person on call in a rotation simultaneously? I mean, simultaneously paging more than 1 person. Anybody ever done that? It's extremely rare, and it is very cool. It's so much better to know that there is a friend. On-call is one of the loneliest jobs. At 3 o'clock in the morning when you wake up, knowing that there is someone who's there to help you who also is cognitively impaired, maybe between the two of you, you are one good brain, right? Also, are you involving the support staff? I think this is really important. I got my start in support, but I think it's really, really powerful to check with support teams for what's weird, what's going on, what you could help them with. Because ultimately, this is where a lot of your SLO violation comes in. It's probably rad that you've got SLO violations. I hope that all your monitoring is actionable and insightful, but at the same time, these are the impacts, and these are the people that we're trying to take care of. Now, I talked about friends and getting your friends on call. Next, I want to talk about on-ramps, which is how do we get more people to join us in on-call. I don't know why they want to. I also, a fun experiment, or not experiment, fun bit of data. Last year, whenever I started this process, I was working with a PhD candidate from Ohio State, and he was helping me interview a lot of the people that we were interviewing. We interviewed dozens of different people at different companies. And at the end of it, I said, his name was Abhi. I said, Abhi, what did you learn from this experience, interviewing all these people? And he said, you know, I have a PhD, or I'm about to have a PhD in computer science, and there was never an on-call 101 class. He didn't even really know. I mean, he knew he had to support his software in production, but there was never any formal education around the idea of being on call. It's a surprise. It's not written in job descriptions. It might be, you know, a willingness to occasionally be on call or something. And some of you might even get compensated for it, which is pretty cool. But generally speaking, joining an on-call rotation is extremely vague. How do you know when you're ready to be on call? Well, it's when you've been here long enough. I'll know when you're ready. But what are the norms? Do you know you're supposed to take your laptop with you everywhere you go? You have to. Do you have reliable internet access at the place that you're going? Do you have your YubiKey with you? Does it work? Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been on call and realized at the last minute I wasn't privileged somehow, or I forgot my laptop or whatever. What are the requirements around this? Am I trained? Have I shadowed? All these sorts of things. We sort of just gloss over this. It's kind of scary. When I am on call, do I know the state that things are in? Earlier when I said you should talk to support, you should talk to your product teams, the reason I say this is it's important to know what's going on in the organization. How many of you work in sort of like infra roles instead of product roles? Okay, so a pretty decent number of hands. If you work in an infrastructure team, do you ever feel a little frustrated that you're sort of disconnected from the overall product? That like, just, you know, maybe the company doesn't value me quite the same. I just, you know, my partner used to joke with me that SRE apparently meant simply restart everything when I worked at Twitter, because that's pretty much what she thought I did. There was the night before Thanksgiving once, where I had to set an alarm on my phone and wake up every hour and restart the message queues that sort of underlied part of Twitter, because someone from One Direction tweeted that if you follow me, I'll like send you a lock of my hair or something, right? And it turns out that unfollowing and refollowing is non-deterministic. It just changes the order that that person shows up in the follow list. So they thought they were showing up at the top, and really what they were doing was a really poorly optimized thing on my end, and I had to write all that into a JSON file and replay it the next day. So if you were hoping to get that, I'm sorry, it was probably lossy. But that is what on-call is when you're an infrastructure engineer sometimes. It can feel very disconnected. I guarantee you that if you will go and talk to these teams, you will feel much more connected. Reliability and resilience and all these things are a feature of the product. If the product ain't up, we can't collect revenue. I have worked with many infrastructure engineers who sort of don't get that connection. That's fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but it's a way we need to, as organizations, feed this into, especially those coming into these roles. What else is here? I don't know. That was my favorite point. The One Direction story is great. I have Charlie Sheen stories too. They're awesome. Known escalations, where do I go with problems? Any incoming things? If you know about an incoming vulnerability, some of you work at organizations where you learn about like CVEs ahead of time. An important thing to know when you're on call, right? Because you're going to have to reboot. Again, you're going to have to restart all the things like I used to. All right, so I said I was going to talk about a program and how to do this in your organization. I have like a minute left to talk about this bit. The things that I want you to think about here are all these high-level items that I talked about. How to measure capacity, how to keep track of the envelope and make sure it's not being violated, how to be proactive, that's my favorite one, how to build on-ramps so that we're bringing people into these tools in an effective way, and then ultimately using that to build a program. This is the sum of all the parts. Who owns this in your organization? I think it's really important that all your teams have agency to decide how to do this the best. Remember, a product team has a very different experience than an infrastructure team. It's important to have that agency, but who's making sure that these teams are well-resourced and that they're not falling behind? If they're falling into that 100% queue range and getting overwhelmed, we need to know that, because all of you knew about that team that had a really bad on-call. We learn about it way before management does. They're sort of like shadow conversations, back channels in Slack, channels nobody's in, the WhatsApp groups or whatever, where we're like, oh, that team really sucks. We need to get off that team. All that kind of stuff. They are going to know, and we need to do better with this. I mentioned the resilience assessment grid. I want to say it again. Respond, monitor, learn, anticipate. When you think about how your organization positions itself to do this, these are the things I want you to think about measuring. Because ultimately, if on-call is the capacity for us to deal with failure, and we're doing it with people, then I say on-call is beautiful. Because all of your wonderful little minds thinking of creative solutions to all these problems are what keep these services up. You could probably all count multiple instances where in the middle of the night you thought of a cool trick to get that thing to make it until just business hours the next day. And you did that on the back of your ideas and your cognition, and that's important. So to build a program, we need to set a leader for this stuff. Traditionally, when I talk to organizations about on-call, I'm often sort of relegated down to middle managers. Nothing wrong with being a middle manager. Line management, et cetera. I talked to a company last week, and their VP of engineering was talking to somebody else about my product, and he said, on-call stuff is just, it's not worth my time. Ooh, I didn't like that answer. It is worth your time. I do understand why you would relegate it to somebody else, but it is important for you to think about this because your organization lives and breathes on this stuff. So set a leader and make sure you're giving them resources. Help them provide tools to the rest of the team so all these teams have a sort of cogent way to work on this together. It's usually not the case that you get paged by 9 different tools in your organization, so at least provide that sort of relationship. Track this stuff with the use method, with the RAG method. Find your own ways. I'm not picky. Build on-ramps so people can get involved more easily. Putting more friends on call, as Alex told us just a minute ago, is a way to keep things fresh and keep things going. The best thing we can do is get more friends to help us out. And also, my favorite one, please get proactive in this. Think about how you can engage and turn on-call into something that is feeding your organization's proactive look into work instead of its reactive. Not just counting incidents, but thinking about how we can position ourselves to be ready for all of this. Maybe it's a week where we have 2 people on call, etc. That is the end of my talk. If you're excited about talking about on-call stuff, please find me and talk to me about it. You can email me here. I don't use Twitter anymore either. It's weird. So thank you so much, and may all of your SLOs be high.